Well, listen, I noticed that we had 20 registered and there are 9 here. So that hits roughly the 50% mark that's usual.
Yep.
I was hoping for a few more, but maybe this evening will be more of a boutique evening, and I like those. We have a slightly more intimate feel to it. So I'm thinking that maybe, Tim, if I let you introduce yourself and then at
Sure.
your own pace, you can go ahead and we can start to get into some of the material. How does that sound?
That works for me. And I think the only thing that I will ask your kind indulgence for is that I am not a major Zoom user. So as I share my presentation in a second, I may be fumbling slightly while I do that.
Got it.
Hey everybody, I was super happy to find this meetup a few sessions ago, and found the topic just of the overall meetup really intriguing, and the last 2 topics fascinating. And Andrew and who were talking about kind of like, hey, is there somebody who wants to talk about something else? And I have a presentation that I've historically done probably for the past 8 or 9 years in various guises that talks about architecture, which is what I do a little bit more, talks about a little bit of philosophy, and there's some stuff sprinkled in that's actually not on the slides that I'll talk about. But just kind of wanted to get into a conversation about it. Anyway, again, there is prepared material. I'll share the slides at least with this group after, but as we want to go through, if you want to, either chime in on the chat and someone can let me know, or kind of raise your hand. This is part of what I'm going to try and figure out. Let me share the content here. I'm used to using another conferencing system, and so I'm used to the sharing and watching people talk and chat thing, but I haven't done it on Zoom before. So let me
good. That looks like it's working.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
All right. All right, can you see that okay? And actually, this is the part that I'm not sure is going to go well. Because when I think I maximize this, I have some slide transitions that probably aren't going to work well if I do this. Yeah. Can you guys see that? Can you see the whole screen?
Yep.
Yep.
And it's not obscured by anything?
And don't worry, if you mess up, we'll just razz you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, we'll judge you. Maybe a little bit of condemnation.
That's all good. I got a tough skin. I got a tough skin and lots of opinions. It's a career. It's a career hazard. So okay. So I don't have the chat window open.
That's all right. I got it. I'll interrupt you if anybody jumps in.
There we go. So I see it over here.
Fabulous.
So again, someone may interrupt me. I might see it. We'll see how that goes. All right, and let me move this. No, that's just like that. Okay. So let me just introduce myself really quickly. I think that my standard bio was in the meetup thing. I run enterprise architecture for a large financial services firm based out of San Francisco. I've had a job like this for the past 15 years or so. I was with Visa for a number of years before that. And actually kind of connecting a little bit more to, I know, some of the worlds that some of you inhabit. I spent about 5 years doing hardcore .com development back when the internet was a baby, doing pretty large websites for an integrated marketing firm that worked with a lot of brick and mortar companies. So the Walgreens pharmacy was probably the biggest thing I worked on. Like the entire Walgreens pharmacy was put online by my company. So back before Agile was Agile, a lot of high-speed internet development and a lot of the lessons we all learned that became Agile. I was an architect working in that realm, and then over the past 20 years, have worked at various places, including Visa, with various practitioners of software development, architects, Agile coaches, et cetera, as we've all sort of trundled down the road of how do we do large-scale systems development. Some of it very user-centric and marketing B2C based, and a lot of my work has also been in business-to-business enterprise spaces, but not in the sort of corporate system space, more in the a lot of transaction processing. Visa, the current company I work at, is a different kind of financial services firm, but a lot of transaction processing. I was at a payment processor for a while. So that's my background. I almost minored in philosophy at UC Santa Cruz, and actually went to UC Santa Cruz on purpose so that I wasn't just getting a technology education. And that's actually, for my chosen profession as an enterprise architect, gone really well for me, because as you'll see in here, there are a lot of things that come from outside of technology that I think are super important to what I do anyway, and how we do technology. So with that, we will hit space and hope nothing bad happens. Okay, I think it's in Zoom. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Who knows what this is? I see a few smiles.
Was that the internet back in the day?
It is 4 machines on the internet, all 4 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I think Dave was around for that. I don't know about the rest of us.
So the first internet connection ever made, October 29th, 1969, which crashed the router or crashed the system that it was running on. Why am I talking about this and talking about architecture? So 10 years later, right? So 10 years on from those 4 systems, it got a lot bigger, right? Well, it actually did get bigger. This is a picture of the entire internet in 1979. Now, when I started my career, it was a little bit bigger than this, but a number of the names of these systems I would still go to. So as an example, I don't remember where it is in here. Today, you all probably know DNS and, kind of like name resolution, all these kind of things. When I started my career in the mid 1980s, now I was in school at the time, you would FTP the host file from a military installation. That was how DNS worked, right? There was a single text file somewhere sitting in a military base that identified every IP address on the internet. And that was DNS. I mean, DNS existed at that time, but that was actually how you got one that worked. So again, why am I talking about this? So 10 years ago, though, so that seems, punch cards and deconstructionist flow charts and kind of, not pretty far from metaphysics. This is what the internet looked like 10 years ago. And those are just subnets. That's not servers. That's not instances. That's not web servers. That's subnets. Okay, so the amount of complexity, the amount of organicness, the amount of intelligence, the amount of change that is out. I don't need to tell you all live in this every day. But if we really think about it, what we do, not just the internet, computer systems, modern computer systems, were born less than 50 years ago. Okay, how much time we had to learn about agriculture, urbanization, industrialization, publishing, communication? How much time we learned to learn? We've had a lot more than 50 years to learn about those things. And so many times I find when we're looking at how do you coach a team, or you're looking at how to structure a system, we are in many ways learning lessons that the rest of society has learned about other things for a very long time. And we're really trying to figure out how to take those lessons and apply them to something that is the same and different than what has come before it. A couple things that are different about what we do than, say, a building architect. So in my profession, chosen profession, the architect of a building and an urban planner are the sort of most common things that you would sort of say, well, what do the computer architects do other than wave their hands and scribble on a whiteboard? But architects that build a building, architects that build a city, that's kind of the best example. The problem is that the technology we're working with changes really fast. So changes in technology are no longer decades, right? Could even be years. It's not generations anymore. It could just be years. And so the thing I liken this to is like, with the building architect, the constants that you're operating with, materials you're operating with, don't change that often, right? So like the example I'll use, so skyscrapers. What was the enabler of the skyscraper?
Steel.
And many people would say steel. The answer is elevators.
Aha.
It's the safety mechanism on the elevator.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
in like Connections, that old show.
Yeah, exactly. I love that show. And so again, the elevator enabled a whole bunch of things that in structural steel and their understanding of building tall buildings, it had existed for a while, but no one wanted to walk up more than 5 flights. So again, we're having to adapt our environment to an ever more changing, ever more complex world. And that becomes truly very complicated for those of us that are trying to drive these changes, or in enterprise architecture or agile coaching, helping people try and drive these changes and understand what that means. So that's what this talk is about. That's why I started out with that complexity, because we're really dealing with something that's really quite different than what it started out, which was essentially a machine to calculate artillery trajectories. You want to fire an artillery shell 30 miles. You had, like here's a good, I think some people probably know the answer to this question. There's been some movies lately about it. 1930, what is a computer? Okay, a computer is a job description of a person that calculates artillery tables. It's a person, not a machine, it's a person. Right, so a computer, one of the original uses of the computer, okay, the modern computers, was to calculate artillery tables, because that was actually something that's really important if you were going to go to war. All right, so problems we'd all like to solve. These on the top probably look fairly familiar, and then we start getting into global warming, finding the magic. Well, where am I going with that? Okay, what if we were trying to build that? Okay, and I wrote this in 2014. Okay, we're still actually rolling up on trying to build that. But if you think about all of those terms relative to, it's not just ones and zeros, it's not just a table we're trying to calculate, but it's that, which is frankly what we're trying to do. And I could probably add a couple more adjectives after that now. That's not so easy. And as a CIO used to work for, always used to like to say, when everyone would come to when someone would give a presentation to him on how wonderful everything is, he would just smile, look at them and say, my daughter wants a pony, right? He was just like, it was just like, that was ridiculous. And my daughter would like a pony, right? So thank you very much for that. All right. So now we're going to pivot to, okay, so this is all very complicated. There's a lot of change. It's very confusing. Let's go to an opposite extreme. What is metaphysics? Okay, you can pull various definitions. The one I pulled: the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature and being and the world that encompasses it. What is ultimately there and what is it like? Okay, one of the things that's different about doing systems architecture, especially modern systems architecture, is you're actually talking about a set of very abstract concepts that are constantly changing. They're constantly interacting with each other. They are constantly interfacing with each other, changing each other. And so the understanding of what it is you're thinking about, what I do particularly sometimes can be naming things and drawing pictures of those things to enable people to actually collaborate around them. What you name something and how you draw something actually changes how they think about it. Okay, and the changing how they think about it, that's metaphysics. Okay, how do I think about metaphysics very specifically? Thinking about, or it's basically the philosophy of philosophy is what metaphysics is. And so when I think about enterprise architecture, I actually, in my mind, and this is partially due to my training as a kid and partially just the way my brain works, I think about it as I am describing a way that people will think about the things we do. Like I tell my teams, it's like, look, one of the, sometimes when we're naming something, it's like, oh, whatever, I don't care what you call it. Sometimes I tell them, look, you need to do the math. Okay, you're about to define a word that people are going to use 5 million times in the next 2 years, right? If you pick word A versus word B, you will cause, 10,000 people to use that term 5 million, or that's conservative. I've done the math sometimes 100 million times. We say it's X. They'll use it 100 million times. So if you get it wrong, or you're not clear about what it is, right? That's kind of a problem, because then everybody has to spend their time unwinding what you didn't think about it in the first place. Okay, what is architecture in one word? It's structure but actually that doesn't work because it's also relationships. And I think one of the things kind of with the build up here in the context of this talk, people can often think about architecture in terms of what is the structure, how do things relate? What is the structure? How are things constructed? What are the things? What are their boundaries? But actually in modern systems architecture, the relationships are much more important. The things change all the time. Okay, the relationships, the networks of relationships, the deterministic and most specifically non-deterministic systems behavior of the environment is actually what's more important. So you actually have to focus more on what the relationships are. And then I don't really talk about it in the deck, but you'll hear it threaded through how people are related to those relationships. I think many of you have probably heard, perhaps all of you have heard of Conway's Law, right? The notion that communications networks in systems mimic the communication networks in the teams that built them. Okay, so there's a reason for that, and that is because we are actually co-creating. When we build something in a modern system, we are co-creating an idea that then turns into ones and zeros that concentrate, divide, come together, move apart, seek objectives, sync, kind of source sync, etc. We're creating a concept that turns into a system, and then that system becomes a living thing that we start feeding, and then we start changing. And
Tim, can I intrude for a sec?
Absolutely.
Quick question: should I feel free to comment, or should I wait? I don't know.
I would say for you, somewhat wait, because I suspect your comments to be quite incisive, but they might take us in a completely different direction. So I would say for you, somewhat wait, but at the same time, I'm very interested in questions. Okay. And that may be true for everyone, but I've just, in the past 2 meetings I've been in with David, I'm thinking he might have particularly interesting questions. Let's put it that way.
Would it help to compromise and just air the question without answering it?
That's fine.
Sure.
If somebody could keep a list, that'd be awesome.
It was just a comment about a book called The Structure of Magic by Gilbert Badler, which you may know about. And when you're talking about this stuff, you're talking about making magic, creating invocations that carry a lot of power. And naming is one of the most critical things. So it's mostly just saying yes. And there's a great book about the power of language.
Yeah, no, this is an area I have approached several times applying to a PhD program in enterprise architecture. There are a couple that exist, and this is a particular topic. This whole presentation is frankly kind of my musings on, if I was ever to do that, the things that I find most fascinating. And as anyone on my team will tell you, I think naming is one of the most important things an enterprise architecture does.
Yeah.
Okay, so hypothesis regarding enterprise architecture. It's an expression of the terms, concepts, and metaphors used to understand the inherent complexity of enterprise and how to use them. Okay, that's a mouthful. But really, again, it's a more formal definition of what I said before, which is that you are kind of constructing a world for people to then collaborate around, change, promote change to, try and understand. And I think one of the things, and it shows up somewhere else in the slides, I think that, and I'll actually state it now, one of the things when I talk with folks about architecture is I'll often get the question, what's the difference between architecture and enterprise architecture? And there are essentially two answers. The most fundamental answer is time, because generally speaking, an architecture ends up being a point-in-time solution architecture, not a architecture for how something evolves. That's not always true, but that's often true. And then the other one is complexity. So to the extent that you're solving a specific problem with a specific team with a specific set of technology, that's a very different problem than if you're solving, a bunch of existing systems, a bunch of new systems, a bunch of I don't know what systems in the middle, and they're all going to co-evolve. That's a very different problem. And so enterprise architecture, it tends to, and one of the reasons that it exists at all, it tends to define the common terms, concepts, and metaphors across teams. So whether it's the mainframe team or the business team or the database team or, the brand new spanking team that's all young kids, or the, people who've been doing this for 40 years people, right? You all have to have a common language or you can't move forward. And so enterprise architecture, that tends to be part of its role. Okay. And now just jumping out, and I've used a bunch of different examples before. I happened upon this. I didn't find the exact article that I wanted because I read it a few months ago. But this was a fascinating article I read on the structure of Hollywood movies. And about 15 years ago, there was a book published that basically lays out minute by minute, okay, the structure of a Hollywood movie. And the book was almost directly based, and I'm not an expert on this because I haven't read it, but it was almost directly based on Joseph Campbell's 17 stages of the hero. Okay. And so over on the right, you see there's this actual thing, and the second link on the bottom lays it out minute by minute in the movie, in terms of how these things happen. Because my wife and I'll go to the movies, and like something will happen, and I'm never surprised by what happens. And I never knew why, other than I just am a very observant person. Well, it turns out they're actually all the same. And this article that I couldn't find, I apologize for not being able to find it. I did try for a while, actually laid out cuts from different movies that are in about the same. This thing on the right isn't minutes. They call it a beat. It's a narrative. The book introduces this notion of a beat, which is a narrative thing that happens within a minute or two. But the notion that basically every movie, all the Avengers movies, all the Pixar movies, evidently, at minute 23 or minute 47, this is going to happen. And one of the articles, one of the things that the article highlighted was you always know when you can go to the bathroom because you know what beat in the movie you're at. So and you just intuitively know it's safe to go for the next 5 minutes. Right. Now, I did find completely, off topic for this, I did find there's actually a site on the internet that will actually tell you, if you tell it what movie, it'll tell you when to go to the bathroom. Yeah. Well, actually, jazz solos, there's a fascinating, I almost did an offsite with my team, and I actually got somebody from the University of Austin, where my team was, to almost come. There's a fascinating study on the nonlinear dynamics of jazz. And it was like some deep math that I am not an expert on. I'm not a trained musician by any means, but it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So I was a small minor student of jazz in school. I'm a big appreciator of that. But yeah, no, jazz is very interesting because it is unlike other kinds of music. It is co-created while you do it. And as an example, the modal structure, I'm a big Miles Davis fan, the modal structure, right, is an architecture. Yes, it is, indeed.
Even there is structure in free jazz.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and that's why I'm not enough of a musician to truly appreciate it, but I appreciate that kind of jazz much more than other people because I can sort of understand it in my hearing, even if I don't understand it intellectually. But yeah, that whole, yeah, there's that was part of the PhD that I haven't done yet in terms of linking those two things together. But I did actually hook up with a professor that actually has studied this. So anyway, so.
Did you notice that Wee's ears started to wiggle?
Bass starts playing by itself. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but actually, if you think about the difference between a symphony and jazz, right? It's in some ways the difference between the architecture of the 60s and 70s and now, right? It's it is an actual thing, and actually it's interesting. A friend of mine, actually a former boss of mine, was at PayPal, and they had a leadership development program. And one of the pinnacle moments in their leadership development program was they had the conductor from the local symphony give a big talk about how running the orchestra was like running an organization. So fascinating stuff. So anyway. So again, these patterns and these notions of understanding what steps there are and how they relate, they show up in all kinds of different places in our lives. And actually, the profession that I'm in, enterprise architecture, right? There's this guy named John Zachman that founded the whole thing. And, he's very egg-headed IBM, kind of computer science guy. But if you look at where enterprise architecture came from, it was actually an anthropological, sociological study of how engineering was done in disciplines outside of technology. Because he was at IBM in the 60s and 70s going, well, there must be some pattern for how we're supposed to do architecture. There must be some pattern for how we're supposed to design. There must be some pattern for how we're supposed to do engineering. Let me go talk to bridge engineers, building engineers, aircraft engineers, plumbing engineers, electrical engineers, all these other engineers. And when he came back and said, this is what enterprise architecture is, it was his synthesis of what they told him about doing engineering and design. Again, within engineering, but not about computers at all.
So I sometimes wonder about what it would be like, instead of imposing the engineering model on all of this, if we impose the idea of like group poetry creation, or
no, and actually that is an interesting. There's several interesting things there, and as an example, software development as a craft rather than an engineering discipline.
Yes.
Right. That's one of the things we saw with Agile. Right. Is wait a minute. This is, it's like there were engineering things going on with this very technical way to do things. Right. But then there was this sort of collaborative co-creation thing going on that was not being recognized as half the problem or more, depending on what kind of software you're trying to build. Right. But then again, if you go back to, Knuth, right, and you look at his writings about software development in the 50s and 60s, he talked about that just in a different way. Right. To him, it was literature. Code was literature. Right. So the art of computer programming from way back when, I'm a big collector of antiquarian computer books, which only go back to like the 50s, but I'm a big collector of them. And I love reading them because it's fascinating looking back now and seeing kind of what they knew and didn't know then, right? Fascinating. So this I find particularly, this is a book I was introduced to in school, but I find it particularly apropos of this topic because I don't know if any of these things sound familiar to you. And again, it doesn't necessarily even apply to scientific revolutions. But if I think about trying to introduce a new technology or a new idea to a technology team, it feels exactly like this, right? And there's a whole book on essentially like when you introduce technology to a society, this is what happens, right? So if you look at Alvin Toffler's Future Shift, it basically talks about, right, from the perspective of the 60s, everything that's happened to us now, like the whole Zoom thing and, virtual everything and working from home and all that kind of stuff. It talks about that in the context of the 60s. This book was written in 1962, but really talks about it in a broader scale of, when the steam engine was introduced or when the printing press was introduced. But again, these kinds of things repeat themselves over and over and over again. And we are, in the technology industry right now, kind of undergoing our first major, well, you could, depending on how you count, there's been more, but I think in many ways it's our first major synthesis of these things, kind of going from, the art and craft and craftsman, tradesperson to industrialization. We're kind of going through that with computers right now. So again, for me, again, this presentation focused on enterprise architecture, really looking at different parts of the architecture, different perspectives, the business perspective, the technology perspective, the application perspective, and the data perspective being the four most common ones, and trying to understand how they fit together, sort of now, but also going forward. Okay, so let me stop there. I'm going to wander into some architecture-ish stuff and a little bit more sort of technology stuff. But let me stop there and see if anybody had anything they wanted to toss on the fire before I plow through.
A dangerous question.
I mean, for me, like reflecting on that, I really loved how you were pointing out that after a while, there's a dominance in the relationships and not so much in the actual thing, the systems themselves. And for whatever reason, I was started thinking about TDD, right? Practice, which is about,
Yep.
It's about testing the relationships, not testing the components, right?
Yep.
because the idea is sort of like when you go and refactor, you want to make sure those relationships are still standing.
Yep.
And it's really making me think about how we work as systems, because then when I'm standing up a T-shaped team or an agile team, in my context, again, it's the relationships. It's not really about the work. We can adapt to the work. And so it's a really interesting way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. Or when you talk about stories in terms of objectives or acceptance criteria, that's taking in many ways a business architecture point of view and describing the software requirements that way. Right.
Yeah. And I'm kind of inquiring into the idea of around internal family systems, like the video that Val shared a while back, like when we talk about parts, the parts that interoperate, there's a lot of relationships there too, right? So, and what happens when the relationships begin to flow, So maybe I'm taking it a little bit far, but that's kind of the metaphysical question.
Not at all. I think a question for probably another time is the relationship between this sort of the mythological aspects of, or the storytelling aspects of enterprise architecture when we begin to design for emergence.
Exactly.
And I know for me that one of a key flow moment for me was in my office in Oakland with a group of other people who were designing a system, and we're dancing with the whiteboard, and boundaries fall, the world becomes luminous. You're grabbing the whiteboard marker out of each other's hands, and this thing is just emerging from this group think, group mind.
Right. Well, my best experience of that ever, we had bought a company. I was at Visa. We'd bought a company, and I went down to their headquarters. It was a much smaller company, but still not a small company. And they had this whiteboard. I love one of the buildings I designed back in the late 90s. It was like all whiteboards everywhere. That was like one of my requirements for the building. But they had like this floor to ceiling 20-foot whiteboard all the way down. And the chief architect and I had really been gotten into it because he had his own ideas that were from his startup of how it was going to be. And I had been brought in from headquarters to tell him how it was going to be. And for a while, we were it just was not happening. And at a certain point, right, he was drawing the user interface for what they were doing and drawing how it worked in his system. And I started at the same time drawing how it was going to work in the new system as he was drawing his, right? And that was, and then that solved the whole problem. That was and again, this is why I think I was telling several of you, this is why I've always, more senior agile coaches and what I do, there's really not that much difference, right? There's a little bit of a difference in terms of technical background or focus or career history sometimes, but sometimes not. But it really is around getting people to organize around a common idea and a common objective and getting them to co-create. Whatever that means. And again, there's different ways to do that. I don't focus as much on the team dynamic because I focus more on the things and the relationships. But as you'll see somewhere in here, right, the organization is a first-class object as well. And you got to think about it that way. All right, so let's throw some more grist for the mill in here. All right, so enterprise architecture, to some of you that have been exposed to it, might have been this one, which is basically the systems architects took a look at the business and said, they don't know what they're doing. We're going to try and create a mirror image of what they're doing. And that's actually not right. That was a good attempt, but it generally casts the business and what the actual end users want in the terms of the way the technology team wants to think about it. That's not right. If you're really doing what I call capital E enterprise architecture, it really is about the business, the applications, the data, the infrastructure, security. It's about all of it and all the relationships. and figuring out where in what time, according to what objectives you need to optimize what, and how to make those trade-offs. And enterprise architecture is actually partially about how to make those trade-off decisions. So it's inclusive of that first thing, but if you're trying to do the first thing and you think that's enterprise architecture, which John Zachman, that person that I talked about a minute ago, a lot of the people that took his ideas turned it into this very complex engineering deconstruction of the problem in order to create this massive, multi-layered, multi-dimensional flow chart to describe the system. It's like, no, actually, that was not the point. I know you thought that was the point. That was not the point. So.
Yep. We can have formal notation and then we can generate the code from it.
Oh, don't even start me on that. Just don't even start me on that.
I just thought it was going to be provocative.
Yeah. Okay, so again, this one's probably like table stakes for the folks on the phone here, so I'm not going to talk about it other than, these still are the old and new table stakes. There's some new ones probably on the right-hand side, but when I drew this slide, almost 10 years ago, right, we're still fighting with this, right? And in many ways, right, when you talk about Agile focuses more on the stuff on the right, but in a larger company, it starts to sacrifice the stuff on the left at some point. And that's the tension that we end up having. Enterprise Agile tries to solve it, does a shitty job, personal opinion. But this is, again, if you wind the clock back 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20, depending on where you worked, right? That thing on the left was IT, right? This thing on the right was a pipe dream, right? So, and is it getting even harder? Again, this doesn't change much in the past 10 years, right? It's still getting harder, right? We've got, in some ways, even more standardization, even more high structure in these cloud environments, given all the complexity and given all the reusable components. But then we also have a lot more user-centric, evolutionary, knowledge work, user-driven kinds of activities. And the way that I like to talk about it, it used to be that people had to figure out how the systems work. Now it's the system's job to figure out how the people work, right? And if that doesn't happen, then someone will just pick a new company, right? They're not going to wait around, right? It's going to be very simple. So how do we think about enterprise architecture? So for me, and some of this is enterprise architecture, and some of this is just, I don't know, me, I guess. Focus on questions, not answers. And again, that's a long, talk about metaphysics, right? That's a long Socratic, Platonic ideal of how to think about problems, right? But just to me, I think I had that background, but it came to me very much in terms of my work, just day to day, that you really have to get people to think about the questions. I don't think it's in this presentation, but I often say that architects in particular, at least the ones I work with or have the pleasure to work with, tend to be really sharp people, but they tend to also disagree rather passionately. And I find that often the problem is it's actually they when you listen to them, it sounds a lot like they don't agree on the answer. And when you dig underneath it, they don't agree on the question. Right? They don't agree on what's trying to be optimized, or they're bringing biases. We talk all about biases. That's very current these days to talk about biases. They bring a lot of biases that they're not aware of to the conversation. And so they think they're trying to solve the same question, and they're not. 9 times out of 10, as an architect, a manager of architects, I'm trying to just get them to look at each other's point of view and understand, hey, the collective point of view here, neither one of you are right, right? It's your job to all get on the same page. So enterprise architecture talks about a system of systems. So again, you can't think about one solution or one system. And this, again, is with Agile teams, this is one of the very serious, very deep holes they fall into, because they don't think about systems of systems. They think about the system they are building today. And for various reasons, and that's great and good. And I've worked in those environments and it's awesome. But if you're in a larger environment that has a lot of existing systems that are, for very good reasons, are not going anywhere, you're just going to get so far with that, and then it's going to fall over and you're going to fail. Or you're going to build so much technical debt and create so much complexity that your customers are going to start seeing it. It's going to be awful. There is no top. Okay, you can't start with the infrastructure. You can't start with the UI. You can't start with the data. You should start in all those places sometimes, but you shouldn't assume that any one of them is driving a large, complex enterprise architecture. Okay, it operates in multiple dimensions at the same time and exists in multiple time frames. So this is another one where I, as an enterprise architect, think it's perfectly appropriate to tell the team, hey, for 6 months, you do whatever the hell you want, just follow these 3 rules. But understand, you're coming back to you're coming back to port at some point, and you better be ready to refactor. You better be ready to throw some of that stuff out. You better be ready to understand that 3 other teams I just told to go do the same thing, and eventually you're going to have to work together. So managing those multiple time frames is also super important and setting expectations around them. Emergent properties, I could write a whole presentation and have pieces of it on emergent properties. I'm a big believer in it is actually the small butterfly things you really got to look out for, whether it be a new technology, a particular insight, a particular user behavior. I want to see that page load in 2 seconds. Well, what does it take to load that page in 2 seconds? So what do you mean I've got to change the master data for the entire system to load that page in 2 seconds? Right? There are some, and good architects can see that stuff early and they will optimize for it early. Lazy developers will ignore it at their peril, because they just figure they can engineer their way around it. And it's like, no. There are some rocks big enough you can't engineer their way around. If you're, it's like, if you took the project and said you were going to be able to pull it off, you just lost. I don't care how hard you work.
Yeah, us agilists know that the most valuable code is the code you don't write.
Yeah.
Right. As opposed to you just keep throwing code at it until the damn thing works. Right.
Yeah. And again, you got to do that too. I mean, I had a CEO throw me out of his boardroom one time, claiming that this thing he wanted to build, which was basically, I won't name names, but this was before Salesforce.com existed. It was another well-known CEO in the Bay Area, and he wanted to essentially build Salesforce. And he was like, no, you just slide pizzas under the door till they're done. And based on the starting conditions I was given, I was like, in 9 months, buddy, no, I was just on an IBM death march. I am not going on your death march. And he threw me right out of his boardroom. So no, he didn't end up building Salesforce.com either. So I don't know who's, was responsible for that, but so again,
hubris, I say.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he's now CEO of his next new wonderful startup that's going public soon. So, I mean, the guy's like famously wealthy, but that particular idea was not a good one. So people and organizations are part of the problem and the solution. So again, this is something that particularly technical architects completely miss. Okay, and that is where I think agile coaches come in and really help with this problem a lot. Is that, you can design the best solution, right? You can have the best answer to your problem. But if you can't communicate it, you can't work together, it doesn't solve the right problem, or other teams don't believe it's going to solve the right problem, you're screwed. Forget it. I don't care how smart you are. Right? People hate you, forget it. You don't have the right funding, the right risk management, the right senior leadership support. It doesn't matter how right you are, you're wrong. And technologists don't get that, right? To engineers in particular, they don't get that. So again, enterprise architecture is structured, organized, and managed, and it's dynamic, creative, and organic, AKA there's a science part and an art part. And you have to do both. And the art part, again, systems architecture and development can be very much a creative exercise, and I fundamentally believe that they are. Doing this level of architecture that I'm talking to you about is more art than science, quite frankly. It's more about the people. It's more about the creative process. It's more about how you think about thinking about it than it is the actual thing you're doing. You better know your shit, right? Because if you go into a room with a bunch of senior architects and you don't know your shit, you can get blown right over. You can get bowled right over. If you're walking in as the senior architect, you better be able to go toe to toe, or you're screwed. But if you think that your job is to be smarter than them, you're wrong. All right. So there's this phrase I use. There's how I think about what I do and how I talk about what I do, and they are not the same. Okay, what I am generally doing right now is talking to you about how I think about what I do. I do not talk to the people I work with about it this way in general. Metaphors, metaphysics, etc. I actually gave my boss a version of this presentation when I started working for about 6 months ago, and his comment on this presentation was, "That was very interesting." Code for, "You're smart, but I don't know what that was." So,
can I throw a question in here?
Sure.
Do you think of yourself as an existentialist?
Yes.
Thank you.
So, and I will say, and I think I qualified before with my near minor in philosophy, I could not define that for you incredibly well to my satisfaction, but yes, in my philosophical journey and my understanding of your question, absolutely. So in terms of how I talk about what I do, right, enterprise architecture is very much, if you look at the business strategy and the technology strategy, what's the next level down? Okay, I've written the technology strategy for several large corporations, and it defines what are the drivers, why are you doing it, where are you headed. The enterprise architecture is the next thing under that tells you, okay, what does it mean when you say we should go off and automate everything? What does it mean when you say we should, move to event stream-based integration? What does that mean? Right? The enterprise architecture is the thing that tells you what it means. Okay, it's a tool for understanding impacts and benefits. So again, if you identify the things in the relationships properly, you can start putting numbers on them. You can start managing them, right? I've created at several companies models that ended up, names of things and structures of things and relationships of things that end up getting baked into the finance system. They end up getting baked into the system that you use to manage SLAs, right? So I create widget 23, but widget 23 someday has a capability alignment score and an SLA realization score and a technical debt score and a TCO, right? It was a scribble on a whiteboard 5 years ago, but it's actually operationalized in a bunch of systems in a large organization, several large organizations that I work for. Constantly evolving and connecting the why, the how, the where, and the when. Again, this comes back to the metaphysics conversation for me, that the way that I think about what I do is really how to help people think through those problems. And those are, at the end of the day, they're not necessarily philosophical problems, but if you think even somewhat deeply about the way that technologists try and answer them, it actually becomes a philosophical exercise to try and get them to think about them the same way, and to make sure that, as an example, they're optimizing sometimes for how they do it, sometimes for where they do it, sometimes for when they do it, and sometimes for why they do it. And the relationship and the sequencing of those actually becomes important, right? You are trying to optimize for $20 million of revenue lift over the next year, okay, but you have to do it in the existing data center, right? Or I don't care what you do in terms of revenue lift, but you got to squeeze $50 million out of our run rate and put it in the cloud, right? Trying to get those strategies lined up with what it actually means for the team, so they actually got something they can understand to execute, is really hard. And so trying to create some of these intermediate layers to create some structure around it really helps. And then again, when this is all done well, all the hand waving that I just did, it actually becomes the anchor for more detailed logical and physical architectures that people actually can build stuff off of. Designs are based on those things. Designs are not based on enterprise architecture. They are based on logical and physical architecture. Now, some people don't make the distinction between physical architecture and design, and that's fine. I'm not a big, like taxonomy bigot or ontology bigot. But at the end of the day, there's some of the things I'm talking about, you would not directly base a software design on, though it might tell you something about your software design. Okay, can we draw a straight line? Right, so I just talked about a lot of really confusing stuff. Can we draw a straight line? Well, the straight line sort of looks like this. You start with business strategy, you go to technical strategy, you do your enterprise architecture, you have a sort of set of applications and technical platforms, and then you do projects. And it kind of works like that. It's all very linear. Looks nice, doesn't it? Easy to explain to an executive, right? Okay, so I did this, when was this? This was 2014. I did this retrospectively on Hadoop. Okay, this is actually what happened. Okay, Google wrote a paper in 2004, okay, around how to do MapReduce. That turned into how do we do cheap fast search. That turned into oh, commodity disks are really cheap. That eventually turned into elastic storage. That then the executives got a hold of it. We want big data now. Went back to elastic storage, over to distributed computing, over to computing software fabrics, and now we're talking about container orchestration. So Hadoop didn't come from, right, and all these other things, didn't come from a business strategy that we should have container orchestration, right? And again, Hadoop's not the only thing that led to container orchestration. But again, these networks and how these relationships happen are not trivial. The technologies take years and years to advance. Different things become hot and cold in the industry. Different problems are trying to get solved. I mean, Google was trying to figure out, well, how do I search the damn internet in a way that I can actually get a search result back in this number of seconds? That's all they cared about. The fact that it actually resulted in, being able to use commodity disks for everything, that actually wasn't what they were trying to solve for. So again, the bottom line with this simple example is simply, it might look like a linear progression, but in reality, it's not. And again, this was one major technology that, over time, there were 30, 40, 60 of these hypercycles going on at the same time, setting aside all the decisions that each company had to make about how to use these technologies. It's very complicated. So while you do have to have some structure on how to think about it, at the end of the day, you need to recognize that, look, this is not straightforward. And it is not, very specifically, it is not a top-down deconstruction that you can manage that way. If you think you're going to do that, you will fail.
There's this kind of thing that is really fascinating while looking at this, because there's a certain quality that you see a lot of maps tend to describe it in a linear way, and it's obviously non-deterministic, right? Because it's not just in that way. There are many hidden subthreads in there too that aren't represented, that are happening concurrently, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, under this cheap fast search commodity disk was what was going on in the hard disk industry at the time, and the density of hard disks and the availability of flash, and it's like, well, I can't use not reliable flash for this because then I've got to have a RAID array, and those are really expensive, and so yeah, it's the bottom line is there are a lot of threads in this at the level that we're talking about. There's a lot of threads, and most technology teams these days have a lot of this stuff going on under the hood for what they're doing, and even within their software architecture, that's actually pretty complicated. And if you don't make some sense out of it, then not for their first project, for their next project, but over 3 or 4 years, it could be really bad. And then again, if you've got a really smart CTO or a really smart architect, they could, within their universe, come up with something, and then they'll get acquired, or they'll have to work with the business unit next to them, and all of a sudden somebody else's really smart idea needs to get mashed into it. And if you haven't thought about this at that level, then you also have a problem.
Yeah, it makes me think of also all those startups that were on their way and they figured out a particular problem that wasn't their goal, and then ended up getting acquired for their technology of what they discovered as well.
Yep. No, and again, that happens all the time, and I think even these days, it very much is. I think the current thinking around R&D that essentially small startups, because their capitalization requirements are so much lower than they used to be, right? That most large companies, and I don't know that I could claim that the one that I work for is doing the best job of this. Most large companies are curating portfolios of startups that they might acquire as an R&D exercise, right? They're not doing a lot of primary R&D on their own, right? Because these startups, they got a smart founder, and he's going to make some money selling his startup someday, and so they can get a decent proof of concept out of that, and probably some technology that's pretty solid. And so that is, in the current thinking in corporate America for a business strategy for doing R&D, it's a lot about actually taking advantage of that, kind of investment from the VC firms, as well as the low capitalization of small startups.
Yeah, that's very cute, isn't it? The R&D is now spelt M&A.
Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah.
No, it's quite deliberate.
Yeah.
So again, I've got one more sort of heavy content slide here, some other ideas that I think I've managed to sort of sprinkle through here. So that time horizon for what I'm talking about is bounded by the strategy, not by projects. And this is, again, one of the places that just your standard Scrum team and even scaled Agile fail on this, right? Because really the enterprise architecture, the boundary is a strategy. It's not a project. It's not even a product. It's a strategy. Now, it could be a product strategy, but often the team just does not, they just don't kind of get there in terms of how they think about that. And again, some of that may not be something they should be thinking about at all, but there's often nobody on the team who is empowered to think about it and at least suggest, you might want to slow down a little bit in this spot right here. Everybody, no, you're an idiot. They just keep going. All right. This one's also really hard. Just enough, just in time to get the job done, which may at times be a lot of work. Okay, so you shouldn't be doing more of this like very complicated overthinking than you have to, but sometimes it can be really hard. If you're building a customer master for a large company, that's a 3-year endeavor just to get the architecture right. Okay, forget converting all the consumers. That could take 10 years, right? But on the flip side, there's a lot of things that aren't that hard. We make them way too hard, right? So trying to find that balance is also super important.
Well,
okay.
That's sometimes a balance you can't find, isn't it? Because you're often dealing with stuff where it takes as much, if not more, work to find out what doesn't work than it does to find out what does, and you can't tell ahead of time which is which, right?
Well, and then you just have a fail-fast strategy, which again, I think agile teams are super good at, right?
Yeah.
So that comes down to the just enough. Sometimes it's like, no, we're I can see the city on a hill. It's 5 years from now. I don't have time for that, right? So then you just got to be clear on what you're actually going to achieve and don't overpromise, right? Consistent, transparent, and repeatable. This is really not easy, right? How do I get 100 Scrum teams at a company, right, all interacting with this process in some way that I can kind of know that they're doing the right things, and if they're taking huge risks, I know about it, and if they're wasting a bunch of time rebuilding the same thing 5 times, that I know about it, right? And that's kind of what I spend most of my day job doing, is trying, how do I get these processes to work and scale across a large organization? This is part of how you do it, right? You got to think about all that stuff. And you've actually got to put some people like this, much like agile coaches, you got to put some people like this on the teams themselves. They cannot be off in the corner somewhere making all this stuff up, right? If they don't have skin in the game, they're not on some of the key programs and projects, it's not going to happen. And that's okay, right? You just need to accept that it's not going to happen. When the CIO comes back later and says, how did that happen? You go, well, there were 2 pizzas, then there was only enough pizza for the development team. Sorry. All right, so this one I'll probably skip, but bottom line is that, if a strategy isn't implemented, it's not very strategic, right? So the point here being, so that's like, it's a kind of obvious, right? It's an a priori fact. If a strategy that is never implemented isn't very strategic, it's sort of an a priori fact. But the reality is we don't think about it that way. It's like, oh yeah, that's a strategy. That's a someday thing, right? I care about that someday. The executives care about that, but I care about getting shit done. Well, what if part of your getting shit done job is making sure that eventually the strategy gets realized? Unless you put some serious controls or serious effort into making that happen, it doesn't happen. So when you're asked to come to an architecture review board meeting or asked to actually write something down, for God's sakes, right? Sometimes it is in service of some of these goals that to a large organization are more important. In a small startup, it's self-correcting. The CEO will get fired. Okay, the chief architect will get reassigned, or the system will get rewritten. And in a 20-person company, 100-person company, that's probably fine, right? But bigger companies than that doesn't work so well. All right, so this is kind of a different view of all this. It's a little bit newer. I was trying to think about kind of how to make sense out of everything that I just talked about in some ways. And so different companies have come up with models like this. Gartner has a model for this. McKinsey has a model for this. I wasn't really looking at any of those when I did this, but I won't claim that some of that didn't seep into my head somehow. But this particular thing, I don't spend a lot of my time thinking about in terms of looking at other people's work. But we often, when we're talking about these sorts of things, we often kind of, on that slide that I had before, there's like the high control and high agility, and we kind of bounce between the two in terms of talking about them and thinking about them. And when I was thinking about kind of some similar sorts of things, I was like, no, that doesn't work for me. Or like Gartner has this bimodal thing. Oh, you're either all in the data center or you're all in the cloud. And it's like, well, no, it's not that complicated. You can have a great, high performance data center that's cloud-based, and you can have a shitty cloud implementation, right? So what's going on, right? And so what I put together here, which again, this is not new, and I haven't really ever done the trace back on what philosophical framework I'm using here, though I'm sure there is one, is that, you really have, kind of, you think about just systems architecture, the notion of high control was generally where we started, right? The notion of, hey, we need to sort of consistently, have a design, right? The notion of functions, like if you go back in the literature, you can see where functions were introduced in Fortran. At one point in time, you wrote computer programs, there was no such thing as a function, if you can believe it. There actually wasn't such a thing, right? It was an invention to have a function, right? So, but once you had functions, then you had system standards calling for, so even that far back in the 50s, right, there was this notion of stability, predictability, standards. But then you started moving into, kind of both scale. How do I take what I did and make it go bigger and faster and cheaper? But then also I want to do all this cool new stuff, right? And so these things are kind of familiar to me, but then kind of the axes that we were playing on, kind of as I was thinking about the struggle that I'm currently facing, it's like those three weren't enough. What else was going on? Well, it's this fourth one up in the right, because sometimes you want speed just to get to market sooner than the next guy, right? Because you're competing with them for, that particular customer to sell that particular product. Sometimes you want speed because you want to be first to a new market, right? You want to define a new market segment, right? You're trying to transform your business. And the reason you want speed isn't just because you want your digital experience to go faster or customers to be happy. It's like you're actually trying to transform the business. Sometimes that's not why you're doing it. Okay, you're actually, hey, I just need to, we get, 10,000 minutes every day in the call center on this, and I'd like to make those minutes go away. Could you please, make me a better UI? And that's, you could save millions of dollars that way, right? Or you could be trying to do something different. Likewise, you could be doing modernization because you got a bunch of old COBOL code, and because we got to refactor the shit out of stuff because, man, the technical debt's horrible. But sometimes you're actually modernizing something so it's easier to go faster so that you can move into a new market, right? And so if you don't think about each of these dimensions as separately, right, sort of separate emergent properties of the system that you're separately optimizing, that depending on where you are and what part of the company have a different relationship, like your finance system can be harder to change than your website, right? Right, your transaction processing system's got a bunch of business rules in it that might be laws, right? And so you got to think about how these things fit together. And when you're talking about the system, kind of like how it, how you're the planning at the highest level, what you're trying to optimize for. And so again, this is my, it made sense to me when I put it together, and it's been somewhat useful. So I figure I'd share it with you. My cat wants to do architecture. I hear him out there.
And this is perfect because, every consultant needs a 4-quadrant
You gotta have
model.
one. You gotta have it. So this is mine. This is original. I'm not claiming, original pride of authorship for all this stuff because most of it's not rocket science. But I have actually looked since I did this to see, and Gartner might have stole a piece of this. Actually, I'll tell you the truth. They might have stole a piece of this, but probably not. They probably came to it on their own. So anyway,
Get a crew, we'll go break their fingers.
yeah, there you go. All right, wrapping up here. Focus on questions and outcomes. Okay, be clear and realistic about time. I think this is always really important to tell architects because they're not. Promise what you deliver. This is actually my slide for the architects, right? This is like, okay, folks, you need to actually be accountable for what you're doing because all that stuff I just talked about is really complicated, but if you don't make it real, you're not doing your job. Listen more than you talk. Okay, I think mostly this presentation today was me talking and somewhat listening, and maybe we have some more conversation here. But I often, I'll always tell the people that I'm working with that, like, look, you got to listen more than you talk, or you're not doing your job. Framework, architects love frameworks. Pick any one, right? Because the point is having a common language, not having your language. And then finally, what will you use it for? That is the best question in enterprise architecture that my boss, when I learned enterprise architecture, would constantly ask me in various guises. I would come to him with all these great ideas, and he would simply ask me in some way, what will you use it for? Right? Because none of this is interesting unless you're going to use it for something. Might be intellectually interesting, but that's a separate conversation. All right, I think this is my last slide if I'm remembering correctly. Oh, we'll skip this one. This is just some more stuff, but I've talked a lot, so we'll skip this one. Always remember, it does not matter how big the sandbox is. This came to me 3 a.m. like 25 years ago. I wrote this in an email. The sand is not yours. Okay, this is really hard for architects. Really, really hard for architects. The sand is not yours. You must share the bucket. Also very hard for architects. Not good at sharing. What is mine? What is it? And it is mine. And then the final one, very important. The shovel is not a weapon. So there you have it.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. I've got to say that what will you use it for is a politer version of the question that I've taken to asking people, which is who cares?
Yes. Well, I care, but the reason that's not as good a question is, well, the automatic answer there is, well, I care. Therefore, it must be important.
Yeah. Is the money coming out of your pocket?
Well, no, that's why. Right. That's why. What will I use it for? What we use it for is a better question.
Right.
So anyway, that's it.
I've got a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if you've taken inspiration from Christopher Alexander, the timeless way of building.
The short answer is no, but I find that a lot of my ruminations and random thoughts here are found in many other people. So yes, if someone could chat that in here so that I could, I love making these connections. You've given me another source in the bibliography for the master's thesis or the PhD thesis I may never write.
It's a 1979 book.
Cool.
I was very tickled by you referencing the hero's journey, because before I got into IT, my degree was actually in English, and it was a joint major with history of ideas, which is European cultural history, and so much came out of that. For starters, understanding that meaning occurs in the listener, the viewer, the reader, and authorial intent is only a little bit of it. It may or may not matter. So you're talking about, are they actually talking about the same question? Yeah, same thing, exactly the same thing,
Yep.
right? And I believe it was a guy called Chris Vogler that wrote an article that got circulated around Disney? No, it wasn't Disney. It was who was it made Star Wars? Because that was where the hero's journey first.
Oh yeah, no, George Lucas, a major direct, acknowledged influence on the Force, and just the whole archetype system there was Joseph Campbell.
He pulled Joseph Campbell in for the
Yes. And I mean, I've been fascinated with stuff like that ever since doing the degree. That how artifacts are constructed and work has been a lifelong fascination. And right now I'm actually going through the work of a guy called Sean Coyne, who was an editor who created a thing called the Story Grid, where he basically went, as an editor, I can tell you if your book is going to work or not. And I can tell you based on the underlying architecture of it and whether it's hitting all of the right points for the genre that you're dealing with. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking, oh, there you go. It's that fractal construction and understanding like the underlying physics of it, no matter what the domain is. If you don't get that underlying physics, it's probably not going to work. And even if it works, who cares?
Yeah, no, for me, I don't know if you're familiar with Sherry Turkle's work. I don't know if you're familiar with her. MIT Media Lab professor. Fascinating. I was fortunate to be exposed to her work when I was an undergraduate. She recently wrote a book that was a memoir, and it's called Memoir of Ideas something. but she essentially, her work is primarily about, it's actually somewhat informs my kind of all my thinking in here is somewhat informed by this. It's about the psychological underpinnings of our relationship to technology. So sort of not a Chomsky thing, but a little bit of a kind of a more psychologically applied view of kind of the Chomsky thing. But she wrote a book called oh, now it's totally escaping me. I just sent it to somebody. Oh,
hang on.
Yeah, I don't remember now. Sherry Turkle is her name. She's an MIT professor. She wrote a book in the 1986 that was called, and I'm totally missing it. Yeah, that's probably her. Second Self, I think, maybe. I think was the name of the book.
Hang on.
Yeah, let me look
Google
here.
knows all.
That's her. Yeah, that's her.
Empathy Diary.
Yeah, Second Self.
Conversation.
Yeah,
Second
yeah.
Self. Oh, there
Second
it is. 84.
Self.
Yeah.
Yeah. Computers and the Human Spirit, and her most recent one is the Empathy Diaries. And she actually talked about her father's profession and how it influenced her getting into what she got into. But her work is very much about this question of metaphors and construction. When you talk about personas and you talk about journeys, some of her work is foundational to that, where those came from.
Oh, wow.
And it's quite fascinating. I've always found her work quite fascinating.
And the whole metaphor thing, I mean, it's not a surprise that David mentioned Bandler. Which was the book you mentioned? It was the Structure of Magic, wasn't it? That's right. Because I mean, Bandler and his co-author Grinder, Richard Bandler, and I can't remember Grinder's first name. They were the guys behind NLP, right? Which is all about how you use metaphor to literally shift how people.
It is.
think,
No, and,
you know.
and I find, I at least again, and that's this is. I didn't extend this presentation kind of around this way, so I don't have the references super handy, but Sherry Turkle is one. John Searle is another. He was actually a neuropsychologist at Berkeley. So the study of the brain and the architecture of the brain and the non-linear emergent properties of the brain and how we think and how it affects linguistics and semantics are actually wrapped into all this. You know, it's like, does the hero's journey come from our biology is a very interesting question.
And the short answer for that is yes, and.
Yes.
And what's interesting is I wrote myself a thing here to reference the structure of mind stuff, which is at that intersection between biological perception, evolutionary biology, and how that structures how we make meaning. And we're challenged as we move more and more into deeper abstractions, where we begin losing, separating a little bit from our evolutionary heritage, and that's creating a bunch of the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah.
But yes, this is a deeper question over whiskey, I think, at some point.
Yep. No,
Yeah,
but I mean,
no.
tying it back to a conversation here, the whole Zettelkasting thing, the notion of how do I assemble information into a meta structure that collectively makes sense, ties into kind of what we're talking about here. And it reminded me, I didn't kind of talk about it then because it was a little off topic, but I had a friend that was actually building an AI, like, you know, not just kind of like I want to play a game, but he was actually kind of doing the exercise of how do I study human physiology and all with everything we know about neuroscience and use that to inform how to build an AI. And I spent quite a long time talking to him about his thoughts about that, which kind of wander into these realms. You know, and I think the other thing I'll mention, which I talked about a bit earlier, and again, I could probably do a whole presentation on, is I find it very interesting in technology now, the different disciplines that we really are taking on. So like when you're doing an ethnography with a client, what are you doing? Okay. Anthropology, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're going through and refactoring code, what are you doing? Archaeology.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
When you're talking about, I want this to be high value, and you're trying to define what value is, what are you doing? Economics, right? And as computer scientists, we don't think about it that way. And yet there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of years of knowledge on how to do these things, right? That we just don't look at. We're starting to, but we don't look at.
Yeah, and that's why this group, we have topics like game theory.
That's why I was moth to a flame with this group. I was like, oh yeah, those are my people right there.
Related. I stuck in the link that I was listening to a podcast about this woman who's studying how we're learning, and the link was like, I just started. I was reading, trying to like listen to it while doing something else, and my brain was already on overload. But she's talking about how the brain functions and like mapping out how thoughts go through all the system. And when you combine it with the idea that your brain is not just it's what's in the head case, but it extends to your entire limbs and your GI tract, you name it, that, and then how does that interact? Because that's what's happening biologically internally, but then there's underpinnings, right? Because how you think is how this body has adapted. The whole thing of embodiment is experience trapped in the body, and then that's going to speak out as part of this metaphysical thing, right? Because it's a that feeds into Conway's law, which then ends up into your enterprise architecture, right? And so when you talk about Zettelkasten, then you're like, it's because like the fascinating thing that I got from your talk was sort of like, and you wonder why agile transformations are so complex. And I think we don't even pay it remotely enough justice about how complex and how difficult it is. Because when you talk about transforming like a large finance company, it's like, how many systems are we dealing with? How much debt, how much things, what's the, and we just kind of come in and like, let's go launch
agile. We want to go agile.
Do the jazz dance.
Yeah, just hands up, anybody here that's ever worked at Visa, just now that we're touching on this, right? How many times have they gone agile?
We were the first.
Yeah. Right.
How many times you go into these situations and you're not even thinking, like not even remotely thinking about systems, right? You're just thinking about, if you think about the systems, you're thinking about the systems of the people, not the systems of the system, much less its interactions where they're intertwined and where they're enmeshed.
This was the point of that. So I posted that quote from John Lilly, in the province of the mind, what one believes to be true. And then he carries it, the next step is in the province of connected minds, what the network believes to be true either is true or becomes true. And that was partly because this is where the mind stuff is. And also it was kind of in response to you saying, so that embodied experience that you're describing, those boundaries are not set.
No.
They're fluid, even evolutionarily.
Right.
They're fluid because we are tribal genetically.
Well, not just that, but it's like that. Then when you start to bring into the idea of like interpersonal neurobiology, that my biology extends into you as I'm talking here remotely.
Get your mirror, keep your mirror neurons to yourself.
Out of me. Get your synapses out. Get your mirror neurons out of me. Then it gets crazy complex, and then so when you're, as the observer, when you're observing something, what are you actually looking at, right?
Yeah. Well, and another kind of like related thing, I think, at least in my mind, it's related, I will offer it, is, if you think about just communication in general, and this kind of goes back to Turkle's work a little bit, and some of it's a little bit of my own theories, though again, if I suspect I look, there's probably people who've spent their whole lives on this. But when you're communicating, especially about technology, it's often seen as a highly technical, highly rigorous, highly intellectual thing that you're communicating about, right? And that can be true of lots of different kinds of writing. But when you're writing poetry, you're actually communicating emotion directly, right? It is a form of literature that communicates, or at least attempts to communicate, emotion without intermediation of thought, right? And so when we talk about, something being user-centric or journey-centric, we're actually talking about trying to look at the problem, not in we might use an intellectual frame, we might use eye tracking and all this other stuff, right? But we're actually trying to interrogate something that's an entirely different level of consciousness, right? And then trying to, on the flip side, turn it into bits and bytes that elicit the right emotional reaction, either because we want somebody to buy something or we want them to feel better, right? And so that's also, again, as I think about the problems that I think about, right, trying to thread through and help the systems engineers understand, well, no, the intent is actually something you're not even thinking about, right? When you sit down with the user interface designer, no. The reason they're not thinking about your system is because that's not their job. Okay, you need to put it in terms that they understand, right? Just like they need to do a better job of putting it in terms you understand, right? Ideally, I'd like everybody to get there, but that's less for an enterprise architect's job and more of an agile coach's job to get everybody there.
Speaking of terms, would you say a little bit more about ontology bigot?
Yeah, ontology and taxonomy are the bane of my existence because I deal in them all the time and I can never remember which one is which. But the short answer is that I do not prescribe to, as an example, using a framework because it is the right answer, right? It's like the framework. I'm just doing some work like this in my work right now, and it's like the framework is thousands of people, often hundreds of committees, attempt to normalize something into a common way of thinking about it. But if you think the point is to follow the framework, you just lost, right? Because it is by definition a generalization. I'd say this.
It is not the goal.
It's not the goal, right? It is a way to help cover all the bases, identify what the concentration points are that are more interesting and hard, right? To make sure that if there's some natural sequencing that people have learned, do A and B first. C, D, and E, figure that out later. But if you try and do B first, or even, my God, you try and do C first, you're going to run into all the same things you ran into. Don't do that. It always fails. So I think in general, my broader, I was using a colloquial term there, my broader assertion would be that I tend to try and take the essence of something and apply that, even if the thing I am applying has a much more precise definition.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I think that raises an interesting challenge and interesting question, because my sense is that frequently people reduce the universe into a framework or a frame of reference because of how much discomfort there is with ambiguity. And so a challenge becomes finding appropriate tokens, language, and other things that is sufficiently simple and sufficiently nuanced, and that you can sort of, like, it's shorthand for language. So like, why are diagrams awesome? It's not the diagram, it's like creating the shared understanding. With
on the flip side, I mean, I'll just reflect on the meeting I had today. While I am not a framework bigot, I understand the framework better than everybody else around me. Because when they're like doing this, and it's like they're saying this, and I know immediately, no, you're over there, right? You're supposed to be over here. You're over there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me explain to you how A.2.7, which I'm responsible for, is this thing. B.3.6 is what you're responsible for. It's that thing. This thing that you think is over there, let me show you in the framework very clearly why the thing you're talking about lives over there. Right? Not because I'm right or wrong, because that's what it says. So if I'm reading it wrong, let me know, but they don't even know to look at it.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't look at it in the right way. So oftentimes I find what I tend to do is I tend to just personally manipulate these conceptual meta models that have these complex relationships better than most people. I do. Okay. We all our superpower. That seems to be mine. But I tend to get super empathetic and contextualize with the people I'm working with to try and understand their viewpoint, and then not shove my viewpoint down their throat, but understand, well, what that I know could help them, could help me to create a common understanding with them. You know, and either clarity, like today there were two pieces of clarity. A, I don't agree with you. I think you're wrong.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm willing to listen, but I don't agree with you. I think you're wrong. But B, right, this is actually what I think you're trying to talk about. And oh, by the way, the emotional problem that you're having that caused you to go there, it's actually in another part of what you are responsible for. You're just not seeing it. Right.
It's interesting because like what you're kind of getting, the way I read and reflect on what you just said and kind of like combining what David just brought up, is that it's like a form of 4D chess. It's not even 3D chess, right? Because you're playing in the dimension of the work, where the work exists, where the physical system exists. Then you're playing at the same time the dimension of the personality. You're playing in this vertical.
Yeah.
Right? This vertical of the system, the people, the organization, and then the whole of that whole thing.
So yes, and you're doing that through time. And
That's right.
and the way that I would actually, and this is where the mathematicians in the room, I apologize, because again, I'm about to wander into something I'm not an expert in, but I know enough to use a few wrong words. Okay. It is a non-linear flow dynamic system centered around emergent strange attractors.
Ooh.
Well, that's my new bumper sticker.
I like it.
Go.
Someone write that into the chat.
Right. So I essentially try and manage these things as turbulence.
Yeah.
Right. Entropy and turbulence.
Yeah.
Right. That's if you think about my metaphysical construct for these is entropy and turbulence and nonlinear dynamics.
Because there's no absolute. The absolute is it's going to be messy, right? And,
well, no, the absolute is there is order depending on how you look at it.
Right.
And my daughter wants a pony.
A nice idea, but not helpful. I just want to throw one more thing out, David, that you kind of inspired me. And
I've got one to throw in after you as well. So yeah,
you know, people who cling to maps, they immediately reach the maps, immediately began thinking like, wait a minute, is that a conditioned fear response? You know,
it is, because what do you do? Like, and it's like I tell people when we do enterprise, because we draw diagrams as architects, right? And I tell people there's a very simple test. Test number one. That anyone, when they get the diagram, where am I?
Right.
That's thing. Question number one, where am I? Right. And then question number two is, where are the things I care about around me?
What's my threat?
Yeah.
It's a threat assessment, right?
Or reward. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's like if you can't, and actually doing these diagrams is almost 95% art, right? Because when you draw an enterprise architecture of an entire company, okay, which I've done a number of times, it's about all kinds of things, past, present, future. There's certain things. It's like, oh yeah, that system goes with that system. Nobody argues about that.
Right.
But it is very much around sensitizing to a lot of different things, and then the good diagrams like this are forward leaning. Right. So like the last one I did, there was this whole layer in the diagram that when I did it, nobody knew why it was there. I mean, I had reasons, and there were certain leaders that I sat down and walked them through it. But most of the people around the company didn't know why it's there. It's now becoming apparent to them why it's there, right? Because it was actually a bridge to a different architecture that we hadn't even talked about yet.
Right.
Remember when I said we were doing magic?
Yes.
This is an instance of doing magic.
Yes.
What's that Asimov quote?
Like, any technology sufficiently advanced will occur as if magic.
Yep.
So Andrew, you cued yourself in. So
yeah. So you mentioned Thomas Kuhn, And he was the guy who came up with the whole idea of a paradigm shift.
Yes.
And I think that our children will look back on this period as the paradigm shift, maybe even we're looking back on it ourselves, where we hockey stick curved
Yes.
way up beyond humans' evolved ability to handle the environment that we are working in or have created.
Mm-hmm.
And that everything that we've been talking about here and keep coming back to in this meetup over and over is, what do you need to deliberately learn so that you can deal with a world for which you are wholly ill-equipped? And I'm seeing this sort of, the part of the implication of it is that you actually do need specialization, and you need generalists who can pull the specialists together. And that as an enterprise architect, you are a particularly specialized form of generalist.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
I'm just seeing this pattern showing up everywhere. And when you look at folks that don't pay attention to this kind of stuff, suddenly you understand how the last 4 years happened. Suddenly you understand how anti-vax and anti-mask happened.
I was kind of...
People can't make sense unless they have tools for new sense making. I mean, it made so much sense that David did a session on sense making a while back. You know, it makes sense to me that I love Cynefin as one of my many go-to tools, something that's going to have me go, I can't possibly grasp this world unless I actually have tools deliberately designed to grasp it, you know.
Yeah. No, and I think for me, and I said it earlier, I do think that, you know, and again, this is, again, partially just an echo of my own particular personal career and other choices, right? But I definitely see, you know, technology, and this is why I started the presentation out this way. Technology, you know, 50 years ago, computer technology, it didn't exist. I mean, you know, like it just didn't exist, like flat didn't exist.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're now 50 years into it, and we're starting to see the turn where it just becomes another human endeavor, right? It was a technical evolution, a technical inflection, a paradigm shift, but it really wasn't that different till right about now.
Well, except there's also the concept of the singularity, which seems interesting.
Well, and
promising.
And that again, you depending on, and that's kind of where I was going to go there, but you did, right? I do personally believe that the combination of human computer interaction and machine intelligence is the actual inflection. Right, that what we're seeing now is basically it's kind of in some ways the tide pulling out, right? Because if the fidelity of the connection between the man and the machine wasn't high enough, you couldn't get the revolution. Now that it's become high enough, right, and the machine is far enough along, quantum whatever, right, that you've got enough computing power to do it.
Yeah.
Right. Those two together. So in some ways, what we're seeing now in terms of human computer interaction is the water pulling out of the beach, and then the tidal wave is going to come.
Yeah. That the fear isn't, you shouldn't fear AI. What you should really fear.
No, you should fear AI. That's my personal opinion. You should absolutely fear it. I'm in the fear camp. No question.
You know, but I'm more concerned about AR. Right? That is a whole different can of worms, because you have manipulations that no computer can do, right?
It's an interest. I guess the question then becomes, what is the intention driving the immersive environment? Because if it's like, some bad actor can create a bad immersive environment or create a Facebook that, you know, keeps the red states and the blue states apart, that's a problem. But that's actually,
it's not just intention either, because with things like this, it's emergent. So you've got to monitor it. And I think every paradigm shift has come with its own set of Luddites. You know, when steam engines happened, people were warning us that if you went faster than 16 miles an hour, you die.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah. No, and I guess,
but you only need to get it wrong once.
Right.
You've got it right every time so far.
Yeah,
right?
and I guess to David's point, I am a believer in the singularity, and you know, and I do think that combinatorial change that is coming at us over the next 100 years, we can't even imagine.
No. Yeah.
Well, to put a damper on all that, I actually think that we're not sufficiently aware of the foundation of kind of the ecology of the planet. So I actually think we're going to kill ourselves off before
that could happen.
Singularity.
Yeah,
that could happen.
But that's just me being realistic.
Well, it's fascinating. One of my favorite topics is how the arts precede science, culture precedes science and technology, and that we're now a whole generation into science fiction that's dealing with AIs that are our buddies, or something that happened that caused the zombie apocalypse. That it's being so
well, no, and
explored,
it's
you know.
it's that movie that movie Her with Scarlett Johansson in it. That was the first one that I'd seen. It's like, okay, you know, that was the next turn in fiction.
Yeah.
Right. It was like, yep, that's it, right there.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome. I notice that we have a few observers tonight who have been holding their peace, maybe waiting for a quiet moment to offer something or to ask a question. Oh, David, it's you and me, and we're like this. All right, you know, I get it. That's all right. So
you let me actually talk a lot, which is always, you know, if you don't rein me in, I'll just keep talking. That's just how it is.
It's great. It takes the pressure off the rest of us. It's perfect, you know. But if any of the quieter members have anything they want to chip in, now would be a good chance. And, you know, no obligation.
Any insights, any reflections that you might want to share? Doesn't have to be a question.
Well, a big aha moment was for me that instead of R&D, we are now talking about acquisitions and mergers. That's actually very sad.
Well, I guess somebody is still doing the R&D. It's just not.
No, it's simply a different economic model. Is really what it comes down to.
Yeah. Follow the money. Always follow the money.
Yeah. Hey. In a capitalist society, that's a good way to go.
So while quiet folks are thinking, and by all means, you can always jump into Slack afterwards if your question only condenses into articulation once the whole session's over. That's fine. We can always carry this on later. But something that I want to propose to people, we and I have been thinking about maybe adding to the meetup a book club. And the first book that I really would like to get to grips with is Donut Economics. I mean, as Tim was pointing out, everything he's just talked about actually comes back to economics, right? Well, Donut Economics is the most substantial reframing of economics that I've come across. But before we actually get into reading it, we might actually do a first session that's kind of aligned with the way how we do some stuff here in Wisdom at Work, where we introduce a technique called photo reading, which is not speed reading. It actually comes from the same source as NLP. It's a technique for approaching a text in a way that allows you to cut out everything except the stuff that you're looking for, essentially by putting yourself into a light trance with intent before you go into the text. You could do a 3-day class in it, or we could go take you through it in an hour and give you references for how you go ahead and do it. Because I like the idea of doing a book club, but I know that everybody's like, oh, I don't have time. Yeah, but you would if you could get through the book in under an hour. So this is something that we're thinking of, and it seems to me it continues the whole theme of how we figure out what's wise right now and what works in this extraordinary world that we're stuck in until we develop time travel and can go and live somewhere else. So we haven't really designed any more than that, but I just wanted to put it out to you all. We and I will actually do a little bit more work as to how this is going to work. Whether it's going to be the other Mondays, once a month. I don't know. We haven't figured that out yet.
So I make a plug for Startide Rising by David Brin. If we're going to do a book club, that's a good book. The teaser is Mixed Dolphin and Human Starship Crew.
Oh, nice. That's very John Lilly, isn't it? Oh, that's awesome. Very good. And for any of you who don't know who John Lilly is, he was famous for doing work with psychedelics in, what were they called, David? You used to sell them. The
isolation tanks.
Isolation tanks, and with dolphins back in the day. And wow. Star-Tide Rising. Very good.
When you want to know more about isolation tanks, you can talk to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. I saw, Val, you turned on your camera. Does that mean that you have something that you want to? No, you're just joining in. Very good. Good. Okay. Well, in theory, we have another 15 minutes for lurking. And I'm, it's always been a habit for us.
Shane raised his hand.
Oh, Shane, did you? I missed you. Good job. You'll have to come off mute. There you are.
Yeah. I guess it kind of comes back to a fundamental question that I'm sort of struggling with and need help with, which is I have a hard time identifying when I don't have enough courage or information. And sometimes I study as a form of procrastination, and sometimes I try and think I need to invent everything myself as a source of hubris. And I'm not quite sure how to manage that relationship, especially when it comes to interconnected systems and realizing that I may benefit from lateral thinking.
There's many ways you could take that.
And I think you just neatly described one of the crises that almost everybody here gets up to.
I mean,
is it up to me to invent the solution to the entire world's problems? Oh, bugger again.
Well,
go ahead, Tim.
No, I was just saying, I'll observe. I mean, I'm personally quite deliberate about how I think about these things, and I'm actually fairly introspective about my own family history and how it contributes to how I think about them. My high school, my college, various career experiences I've had. So, I mean, I claim no special wisdom, but but whatever thoughts about these things I do have, I've accumulated them over my entire life, right? This is not something I learned in a year or two. And so I would just, you are much, just at least visually looking at you, much younger than I am. And so I would, I would offer that there were certainly periods in my life I studied these things more. And I think for me, like the things that I talk together and knit together now were very point in time experiences. My philosophical inquiry was in college, right? And I read Searle, and I had some other things that were all connected there. And then, my study of interpersonal dynamics was later in my life, right? My study of family systems probably more through therapy and other things, kind of as I was becoming a kind of mid-aged person. So I'd say my advice would be find your bliss around some of this, and then focus on a dimension that kind of meets you where you are right now, and meets you maybe in relationship to other people you're around, because it's also something I think that can be very difficult to do. I certainly lost years of my life spending time doing it alone.
Yep.
Right. So I would say pick something that people around you that you care about, or relationships you care about, or problems you care about, have some resonance with some of this, and then just pick something and just drill into it, and then just see where it takes you. Then don't at the same time be confined. So that's my 2 cents on your question.
David, did you have something to say?
I want to throw in a little something. One of the things that I had to learn in life is that sometimes things occur as a problem, and that I have a human instinct when something occurs as a problem to try and make sure that that isn't actually a reflection of a shortcoming of myself. And so I'd often go and try and solve a problem as if it was a way to just better myself. And it was extraordinarily relieving to realize that I could reframe things like that from being a problem to being a situation in which I might actually be able to cause some kind of shift. And so what you were describing, I think, is a situation. It's like, in this world, it is that way. And that we often find ourselves going, am I supposed to know about this? Do I have to invent this? Has somebody else done it? If somebody else has and I don't know about it, does that mean that's something wrong with me? If I go and deal with it myself and I figure something out, am I right? All of us, particularly if we're thinkers in a group like this, are having thoughts like that the whole time. The side effect is that when you get to be old farts like me and David, you know just tons about tons of things, and it's phenomenally helpful and useful.
Particularly if you become good at bullshitting.
Yes, and trust me, you're in very good company when it comes to bullshitting.
I have a comment to make,
Yeah.
and it's not. So one common theme in what I heard you say, Shane, is that there's a foundation of isolation. And this is endemic in our culture. And so one, it's make friends with that, but also it's, we're not very skillful at collective sense making and a shared capability of entering into that inquiry. The inquiry is real and you're not crazy because you have it, or because you feel anxious about it. This comes with getting a body and living on this planet. So there's an aspect of that which is, to embrace that inquiry as a powerful source of motivation, but don't hold it by yourself.
Yeah.
Share it with others who are also, and frankly, there isn't anyone who, I suppose there might be a couple of enlightened beings, but if they're really enlightened, they're going to give you a hand anyway. So,
yeah, if I may also yes and because I'm gonna impose myself on the old timers club because I'm starting to get close. I think there's especially in this day of age, because you get inundated with information. I get inundated with hanging out with y'all here, right? But I think there is something to be said about depth, right? There's something to be said about digging deep. Immediately when that asked me, whenever somebody learns to play jazz, they're like, oh, which solo should I transcribe? It's like, whose solo should I transcribe? Should I go and transcribe everything? No, just the one that interests you. Dig deep, hard on it, pick it apart.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm kind of at a point in my life now where I did that time, right? I paid my dues in that sense. And I didn't know what the hell I was doing back then, but I just knew that whatever happens, I'm loving this. I'm just going to dig deep. And I'm kind of beginning to be at the age was why I love hanging out with you guys, because I'm like, oh, I can put the pieces together now. They fit, the beginning to fit, right? But not until now, right? So it's exactly what everybody else said. Follow your bliss, go follow what piques your interest, dig deep into it, and don't worry about, oh, I don't know everything in the world, because you won't. There's too much. Ask Andrew, he's got 6,000 books. It's insane, right?
And they keep writing more. God damn it.
Right? Tell him to stop,
Right.
So
I think we should all pile on to Shane now, one after another, and give him our
It's like that. It's like
advice.
I'm gonna
the airplane, smack him around a little bit.
Yeah. I'm gonna throw one more thing on, which was actually in the slide. It was on the slide I skipped, which actually kind of, I think, to me, speaks to some extent why it's important to go deep and what you learn from it. And what I wrote, I'll just read it here. No matter the discipline, no matter the issue, no matter the complication, all problems are repetitions of a small number of fixed patterns.
Yeah.
So in many cases, what you're hearing from some of us has been at this a while. We've just seen more and more instances of those patterns and come to recognize them more clearly. That doesn't mean that we go after the first or the second or the third or the fourth, or you're a smart guy, 30th, right? That the patterns aren't going to become obvious to you either. So I think, frankly, being more aware that it's like, why do we learn, I don't know if all of us did, but, and why did children need to learn or told to learn calculus, right? I haven't used calculus since I, aced calculus in college, right? but it's actually a thought process and a notion of rates of change and a relationship of things in your brain. And it's probably actually laying in some neural structures in your brain that are actually the thing you're learning is the pattern. It's not calculus. It's the way that you learn calculus is the thing you're learning.
Yeah, but wait, there's more, because that's what we're going to get to when we're going to get to a future talk about wholes and parts. Because to understand the hermeneutic circle, to understand the whole, you must understand the parts. To understand the parts, you must understand the whole. So if you dig deep on one topic, you might reveal the world to yourself.
Yep.
Right?
There you go.
Mic drop.
Mic drop. Very good. Now, I don't have anything lined up yet for 2 weeks' time, but that's what we and I are continually talking about. So probably before next weekend, we should have something lined up for the week after. So, you guys know which space to watch. Tim, thank you very much. I know that you had some apprehensions that what you're going to present was so technical that, it would somehow be not connected. Look what happened.
Yeah.
Right. Well done. Right.
Oh, that reminds me. I'm still looking for work. So find something fun and exciting that you want to partner on.
Good. Anybody
I
else?
don't want to work by myself anymore, and I don't want to work on stuff that's dumb.
Yeah. And you know what? One of the things that dawned on me the other day was the extent to which the pandemic has revealed to us that certainly if you live in the States, we're all living in something like suburbia. We're all at home and it's lonely. And that deep need for social connection that humans have, we don't get it around the campfire in the village. We get it at work.
Yeah.
And it's been a big transition for us trying to figure out how to do it like this, watching Celebrity Squares on Zoom. And so, David, I really get your request. The little bits of social feeding that we got by going and working in the workplace, no matter how daft it was, provided for more than just income.
Yeah.
And I really get it. I really get it. So I'll have a little bit of a think. I might have some daft ideas. There won't be any money behind them, but you never know.
I'm good at daft ideas, so.
Yeah, well, QED. There we go. Good. Has anybody else got any other requests, announcements, acknowledgements?
Well, you guys, I gotta say just gratitude to everybody here for just showing up. I mean, really talking about COVID and everything. This is how I stay sane, just by hanging out with a bunch of you. So
More sane.
Sane-ish.
Sane-ish.
Yeah.
Sorta.
Well, may everyone's vaccine be almost symptom-free. The new blessing of our era. And anybody still waiting on even their first one? Oh, Shane, really?
Many, many months in the future.
Ah.
Oh,
Well,
bummer.
It's on its way.
We had company over for dinner.
What?
Recently.
Nice. Yeah, my wife and I went to get a drink right before this because we're at our 2 weeks past the second shot today. So we ran to the local bar, which we were still outside, but we just went in for 5 minutes to just get a drink and came back. So
yeah, I'm 2 weeks past on Wednesday. Next weekend, we're going away to celebrate my missed 60th, my recent 61st, and all of the wedding anniversaries, because our wedding anniversary was yesterday. We're actually going to go away, stay somewhere, go to restaurants.
Good Lord.
Come on, I know. Hey.
that's 2 weeks. 2 weeks for us. Same thing.
Yeah. So sorry, Shane. It's coming, mate.
Yeah. Notice that we just piled on with all the stuff that he's missing. Yeah.
So that'll teach you to respond.
We are so empathic. What a
right.
Oh no,
man.
everything's still pretty open here, except for the fact that we just went back into a state of emergency.
Oh God, you're in Japan, aren't you? Where are you in Japan?
Just south of Kyoto.
Got it. Wow. All right, my lovelies. Well, I see that we're just coming up on past. I think that was a splendid session. Thank you again, Tim. Thank you all. And with that, I think I can declare this session complete. Thank you, everyone. Toodaloo.